We had him a meeting or two ago talking about flying supplies into Warsaw in Liberators out of Italy. 2,000 mile nautical mile round trip. Today he's going to talk about something that also involved very long flights, but of a different type. It was on DC-6B, flying for NASA. I'm going to ask our esteemed member Bomber Barty to come up and tell you about these exploits.
I'd just come back from the United Kingdom where I'd been flying as test pilot with Beagle aircraft, and they sold out to Scottish Aviation and I wasn't going to Scotland. It was too damn cold in England for me, and I'd come up from Tasmania, so I thought I'll go somewhere where it's warm. And I'd been to Perth a few times, and so I came to Perth, and I got myself a job at Exmouth as a field engineer. And this was in 1968, the beginning of 1968. I worked up on the North West Cape for a year alone as a field engineer, fixing all the equipment, troubleshooting for the US Navy, and they called me Smersh because my origins were I was born in Russia, so it didn't seem to worry them at all that I had a Russian background. Although it was the middle of the Cold War, about landing on the moon, I guess, because in 1962 John F. Kennedy had made a promise that men would land on the moon by the end of the decade. So, and since the Russians had done many firsts in the space program, I think the Americans were pretty serious about being first. So the security and secrecy about the whole business was very, very strong. You weren't allowed to take cameras. When I eventually arrived in the US, no cameras were allowed at Houston or Cape Kennedy as it was then. What happened actually was that while I was working at Exmouth, they asked me to go down to Carnarvon because they were having some trouble with some of the equipment. I went down there and I was working on some of the satellite equipment that they had there, because that was one of the early tracking stations. There were 52 of them around the world at that time. There were 4 in Australia, Tinbinbilla and Moochie and others too. I think there were a couple of others besides. While I was there, I got a call from Perth to say that a friend of mine, Harry Sanford, who had been a US Navy pilot during the war and was the same age as me, I was 46 and so was he, and I'd known him I'd met him in the Mediterranean. I'd known him for some time when I was flying in the Middle East and the Med. And he called me up and said, "Can you get away from Carnarvon? Can you get permission to come down? I need a co-pilot. My aircraft's got engine failure here. I've got an engine change going on at Perth Airport. I need a co-pilot, and we have a satellite launch. So we have a satellite launch within a week's time, and we can't fly without 2 pilots. And since you'd flown Liberators during the war, and the cockpit layout is very similar on the DC-6B, the reason they used a DC-6B at that time was that at 30,000 feet, the equivalent velocity, that's Carnarvon Tracking Station, of course, that's the aircraft, and it was specially equipped for long-range flights. The longest flight were 10 hours. It had a range of about 4,500 miles. We cruised at 30,000 feet at an indicated airspeed of 220, 225, and that gave us we had a range of about 4,500 miles altogether. So that was the engine that had failed, and that's the cockpit. So this is showing how, you see, that the equivalent speed across the tracking station was equal to the apparent speed of the satellite in orbit. Later on, of course, they got different aircraft and finished up with jets and so forth. But at that time, the DC-6B was the ideal aircraft. We had a crew of 12 altogether, up to 12. We had up to 7 technicians, a flight engineer, 2 pilots, and a navigator. And we had sleeping quarters on the aircraft aft. We had microwave oven so we could make meals. We had mostly K rations, but you could heat the food. I would fly the aircraft for 5 hours, and Harry would sleep in the bunk down the back, and then he would come up and take over and fly for the next 5 hours. We flew up from Perth to Carnarvon to collimate the tracking station. This was done with downlink and uplink systems, so that because on the aircraft we had the same equipment that the satellite would have when it was launched, and that means that the station could then downlink and all the information from the satellite. Although there were 52 satellite tracking stations around the world, they were pretty specialised, so we probably only used a dozen on one mission. By the time I joined the aircraft in Perth, it had already done its European leg. Of course, we flew west to east because the satellites were launched to follow with the advantage of the Earth's rotation, because the Earth turns west to east, of course. Correct? Yes, the sun rising in the east and sets in the west, apparently. Appears to, because of the Earth's rotation. So they had already done that leg, and the next leg was up to Carnarvon to collimate that, and then on across we went up to Darwin from there. From Darwin we went to Brisbane. There we refueled and stayed overnight, and next morning at about 7:30 we took off and headed out into the Pacific. We up to Nandi in the Fiji Islands. From there we flew over that tracking station, collimating it. We then went to Pango and landed there, refueled again, stayed overnight, and took off the next morning and flew north east to Hickam Air Force Base. From there we then flew due east to California, to Los Angeles. We stayed overnight in LA and then flew down to Houston, which was the base for the DC-6B. I was taken around the base, but you couldn't use cameras. Everything was so secretive at that time and classified. Then they flew me in a Mitchell from there. I left Harry there and I flew in a Mitchell to Cape Kennedy. And they took me around the base again and gave me an astronaut's pen, which I still have, the pressurized pen which the Americans had developed. The Russians, of course, use pencils, so it sounds like common sense to me. Then eventually I was flown back to Houston, and I returned to Exmouth on what they called a MAC flight, which was a supply flight to the communications base, and I flew in a C-130 back to Exmouth and went back to work on the base again. Sometime later I got another call from Harry, and the reason that he called me before was because his co-pilot had had a heart attack and finished up back in the States and had passed away. This time he called me and said, "I just want you to come because I think he should come and bring your girlfriend. My wife was, and my fiancée, my later wife. I married her in 1970, which was later. We were getting then close to landing the man on the moon, so I went on another trip with him and we did a similar flight pattern. And then on my 47th birthday, Apollo 11 arrived in orbit around the moon, July the 19th, on my 47th birthday. By coincidence, the Apollo 11 was circling the moon. And on the 20th of July, they finally landed on the moon. On the way down, actually, to the landing, the onboard computer, which was supposed to keep the lander in the correct attitude, went haywire, and the lander was tipped almost upside down. Neil Armstrong managed to get control of it manually and righted it, but it was then coming down onto a huge pile of rocks. He managed to fire the thrusters again and avoid it, but when they landed, they only had 30 seconds of fuel left as far as the landing was concerned, and of course they had to leave enough to get them back up to the command module, to Collins, who was up there waiting for them. They spent a total of 21 hours on the moon, with he and Buzz Aldrin, and we all know that, of course, he said one small step for man and a giant step for mankind. But he also said sotto voce, which was actually screamed out very quietly. He said, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And for many years, he wouldn't tell anyone what he meant, and they had searched through the Russian space program and they thought maybe he was referring to a Russian cosmonaut. Good luck in their moon landing, which never, of course, occurred. And then they looked through their own program and there were no Russian names there, no Gorski there either. And eventually Neil Armstrong broke his silence and told them that when he was a kid, he was playing in his backyard and he lived next door to Mr. and Mrs. Gorski. And he was playing with the baseball and it landed over by the bedroom window of the Gorskis. And he heard this woman screaming her head off and she shouted, "Sex, Mr. Gorski, sex! You'll get sex when that kid next door walks on the moon." That's a true story. A little bit of an afterthought to that. So, also while Harry Sanford was in Perth with his aircraft, before I joined him, I was the editor of the Astronautical Society. I had helped found the Astronautical Society in Perth, and when the aircrew and technicians of the NASA DC-6P aircraft arrived in Perth, and Harry called me to come down. I thought it would be great if we could visit some of the air museums. So we went to, I thought a visit to the Beverly Aeronautical Museum, the Air Force Association display at Bateman, and Channel 7's collection at Chewett Hill would be interesting. A flight schedule prevented the trip to Beverly, but at Bateman the captain admired the Spitfire, etc., and we drove to Channel 7. We entered the gate and were walking towards the display when we were stopped by the gatekeeper, inquiring where we were going. I explained the purpose of our visit and was told to write for permission. When I said that the captain was flying to Carnarvon that evening, I was told that the gatekeeper would lose his job if the boss saw people looking at the aircraft. Embarrassed, we peered through the fence and drove off. The United States Air Force Museum near Dayton, Ohio is open every day of the year except Christmas Day, and admission is free. The San Diego Aerospace Museum operates on a similar basis. This is the letter I wrote to the paper. Can someone then enlighten me why Western Australia is so different? TVW spokesman, we sincerely apologise for this inconvenience. The aircraft are at TVW for people to see. Many visitors walk off the street each week to look at them. Written permission certainly isn't required. Steps have been taken to avoid the recurrence. So that's my story, that's my part of it all. Thank you. Later on, I was involved with, during the solar eclipse in 1974, I was involved as on the recovery vessel for we had 2 rockets fired from Lancelin to study the Lyman Alpha corona of the sun. But unfortunately, they lost one rocket and never found it. The other one didn't get in the right attitude to take the pictures. So the whole mission turned out to be a disaster. And I was in charge of the animation and camera work. But it was very sad, really, because we put so much effort into it. And it would be good for WA. Thanks very much, David.
A couple of slides which didn't come up throughout the talk. Slow enough for you, Murray?
Yeah, no, he was right before.
I'm still trying to read that top line.
These were the tracking stations, Carnarvon, Ushea, Woomera Parks, Honeysuckle Creek and Tidbinbilla. After this orbit, the next one progressed westward, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
Oh, further westward.
And that's what it was all about.
Yeah. Gee, they were lucky.
Thank you, John.